I moved to New York City a little over a year ago, mostly because the job offer was irresistible and the idea of living in such a vibrant, bustling place seemed thrilling at the time. My apartment was modest, a one-bedroom on the 5th floor of an aging building in the East Village. The street below was alive day and night with honking cars, chattering pedestrians, and the occasional street musician trying to make a living. From my living room window, I had a clear view of the sidewalk and the storefronts. But what caught my attention wasn't the street itself. It was the old fire escape that clung to the brick wall just outside. It was strange, really. Everyone seemed to ignore that fire escape. I'd never seen anyone use it, at least not during the day, and the neighbors never seemed to glance its way. It was rusty, and some of the metal steps creaked ominously whenever the wind picked up. I assumed it was just a relic that was there in case of emergencies. But over time, I began to notice something unsettling. The fire escape never seemed quite empty. The building's layout meant my apartment was directly adjacent to it. I worked from home most days, so I spent hours sitting near the window, laptop open, headphones in, sipping coffee while tapping away on the keyboard. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I started catching fleeting shadows on the fire escape. At odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, I would see movement. A silhouette, just out of clear view, shifting behind the bars, disappearing whenever I looked directly. One evening, I'd been working until nearly midnight, the city's noise dimming into a distant hum. I glanced up, and there it was again, a shadowy figure crouched on the landing above mine. My heart jumped, and I froze, unsure if I was imagining things. I blinked hard, and it was gone. I told myself it was probably just a homeless person taking shelter or a rat. But something about the timing and the way the shadow moved felt deliberate. I started locking my windows, even though I'd never considered it necessary before, and I made a point of not sitting by the window after dark. Still, the feeling persisted. I began hearing subtle noises, too. Soft tapping against the glass, like knuckles rapping lightly, or the faint scrape of metal against brick. It was never loud enough to be certain, but enough to set my nerves on edge. One night, I decided to test my suspicions. I left the apartment in complete darkness, turning off every light and pulling back from the window. I sat silently in the living room, straining to hear any sound from the fire escape. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then, as soon as I turned the lights back on and moved closer to the window, I heard it again, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. I pulled the curtain aside cautiously, expecting maybe to catch a glimpse of someone trying to get my attention. Instead, I saw nothing but the empty metal stairs glinting under the street lamp. The building across from mine had windows that looked directly onto the fire escape, but all their curtains were drawn tight. I wondered if the person was hiding somewhere else, using the fire escape as a vantage point. My mind started racing with scenarios. Could someone be living there? Was the landlord turning a blind eye? Were my neighbors even aware? I messaged a few friends about it, half expecting them to tell me I was being paranoid. But no one had ever mentioned anything about the fire escape. The silence felt heavier than any reassurance. The next day, I called the landlord's office. I tried to keep my voice steady, asking casually if anyone had access to the fire escape or if there had been any reports of break-ins. The receptionist seemed evasive, brushing off my questions with vague promises to look into it. When I pressed harder, she said, "The fire escape isn't supposed to be used except in emergencies, and we don't have any tenants with permission to access it." That answer didn't sit well with me. I knew old buildings like this often had cracks in security, but I hadn't expected the landlord to be so dismissive. I began to check the fire escape more deliberately, peeking out whenever I could. Sometimes, I found small signs of activity. A cigarette but tucked into a corner, a scrap of paper caught in the railing, even faint smudges on the metal steps, as if someone had been climbing them recently. One afternoon, while I was working, I heard the tapping again, but this time it was accompanied by a faint scratching noise. My heart pounded as I approached the window cautiously. Peeking out, I saw a flash of movement followed by a glint of something shiny just out of reach. I reached onto the windowsill and found a tiny folded note, damp and crumpled. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The message was scrawled in messy handwriting. "I see you." No signature, no explanation, just those 3 words. I froze. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. Who was watching me? How long had this been going on? And what did they want? I debated calling the police, but hesitated. What if it was a prank? What if I was overreacting? Still, the note confirmed my worst fears. I was not alone, and someone was using the fire escape as a secret lookout into my life. That night, I installed a small webcam by the window, facing out toward the fire escape. I wanted to catch whoever was doing this, but the footage was inconclusive. The camera caught nothing but empty stares and flickering shadows. It was frustrating and terrifying all at once. I started changing my routines, closing the curtains early, avoiding the window, even leaving the apartment at odd hours to throw off whoever was watching. The city around me never felt so claustrophobic, the usual hum of life replaced by the constant echo of unseen eyes tracking my every move. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was a creeping dread that settled deep in my chest. The anonymity I'd once enjoyed in this urban jungle was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense that the fire escape was no longer just a forgotten relic, but a gateway for someone's intrusion. Days blurred into nights, and I found myself unable to relax in my own home. Every noise, every flicker of light outside the window, set my nerves alight. I began to wonder if anyone else had noticed the strange presence, or if I was truly alone in this nightmare. The fire escape loomed just beyond the glass, silent except for the faintest whispers of movement. And I was left to wonder how long this had been happening, and what might come next. After that note appeared on my windowsill, everything changed. What had once been an uneasy suspicion turned into a gnawing obsession. I couldn't ignore the fire escape anymore, not when it had become a silent witness to something I couldn't quite understand. Night after night, I sat by the window, eyes darting to the dark metal stairs, waiting for some sign of movement. And more often than not, I got what I dreaded. The first few times it was just shadows again, barely more than vague silhouettes disappearing when I looked straight at them. But then, the tapping started to get more persistent. A steady rhythm, almost like someone counting seconds or trying to send a message. At times, I thought I heard faint whispers, but it was impossible to tell if that was real or my imagination running wild. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a resident from another floor who had somehow gotten access, or a homeless person seeking shelter on the fire escape when the weather got cold. I even convinced myself the tapping was just city noises, echoes bouncing off the brick walls. But none of those explanations fit the small objects I kept finding on my windowsill. One morning, as I opened the curtains, I noticed a tiny, folded piece of paper tucked behind a flower pot I kept on the sill. I unfolded it carefully, heart racing, and saw a crudely drawn smiley face staring back at me. Beneath it, scribbled words, "Watching you always." The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, but the message was chilling. I stuffed the note into my pocket and scanned the fire escape. No one was there, but I spotted faint footprints in the dust, leading up the stairs and then vanishing on the landing above. Whoever it was, they were bold enough to leave these little tokens as if daring me to notice. I started leaving my apartment door unlocked for a few minutes when I left for work, hoping to catch someone inside or at least hear signs of unauthorized entry. Every day, I returned to find another small item, a cigarette butt, a handful of pennies, a scrap of fabric that hadn't been there before. It felt like a twisted game, and I was the unwilling player. Trying to get some answers, I reached out to the landlord again. I called the office and explained my concerns more firmly this time, mentioning the notes and objects left behind. The receptionist was less evasive, but still offered little help. "We've had no complaints about the fire escape," she said flatly. "It's secured, and tenants don't have access unless there's an emergency." I pressed her for details on security measures. "Are there cameras? Any recent break-ins?" She hesitated. "The building is old, but we take safety seriously." That vague response only made me more suspicious. One afternoon, I decided to take a closer look at the fire escape during daylight. I slipped outside onto the landing, heart pounding as I stepped onto the rusty metal. The surface was cold and uneven, with patches of peeling paint and rust spots. I examined the railing and stairs carefully, looking for signs of tampering or hidden compartments. Near the bottom step, I found a small pile of cigarette butts, some crushed and some fresh. A few feet away, a scrap of folded paper poked out from under a loose plank. I unfolded it and found a simple drawing of my apartment window, with an arrow pointing at it and the words, "I'm close." I shivered and tucked the note into my jacket pocket. The fire escape wasn't just a forgotten emergency exit anymore. It had become a staging ground for whoever was watching me. I realized then that they must have been coming and going unnoticed, slipping past any security that was supposed to be in place. Back inside, I installed a motion sensor near the window in the hopes of catching movement on the fire escape. The first few nights, it was quiet, but then the sensor beeped repeatedly around 2 a.m. I grabbed my phone and peeked through the curtains. There, crouching on the landing, was a figure dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by a hood. I froze, heart hammering. The figure didn't move for several minutes, just sat there silently, staring at my window. Then, without warning, they reached up and tapped 3 times on the glass, as if sending a message. I wanted to scream or call for help, but I was too terrified. After those taps, the figure slipped away, disappearing into the shadows along the fire escape. I checked the motion sensor footage the next day and saw the blurry image of the person, but it was impossible to identify them. I began to dread nightfall. The tapping and shadows became part of my routine, a constant reminder that I was being watched. I avoided sitting by the window, pulled curtains tight before sunset, and stopped leaving anything valuable near the sill. I even changed my habits, taking different routes when I left the apartment, varying the times I came and went, hoping to throw off whoever was lurking nearby. But the feeling of being monitored only deepened. One evening, while I was working late, I heard a faint scratching noise at the window, slower and more deliberate than before. I approached cautiously and saw a hand pressed against the glass, pale, thin fingers with chipped nails. I jumped back in shock, but when I looked again a moment later, the hand was gone. I called a friend, Jamie, and told her everything. She was horrified and insisted I call the police. I hesitated, worried about being dismissed as paranoid or overreacting. But when I mentioned the notes and the figure on the fire escape, she convinced me to at least file a report. The police came by the next day, taking statements and inspecting the building's security. They said they would increase patrols in the area and check for any suspicious activity. But they also warned me that without concrete evidence, it would be difficult to act. I felt caught in limbo, aware of the threat but powerless to stop it. I started locking every door and window obsessively, installing extra locks, and even a small alarm system. The landlord finally agreed to install a security camera pointing at the fire escape, but the damage was already done. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep eluded me, and anxiety gnawed at my every waking moment. Friends tried to reassure me, but I saw the worry in their eyes. The city had lost its charm, and my apartment felt less like a home and more like a trap. Despite all the precautions, the tapping and shadows never ceased. Sometimes, I thought I caught glimpses of someone's face reflected in the glass, watching silently from the fire escape. The notes kept coming, becoming more cryptic and unsettling. It was clear whoever was doing this knew my routines, my habits, and where to find me. The fire escape was no longer just an architectural feature, but a stage for a sinister game that I couldn't escape. And every night, as darkness fell, I wondered what they would do next. The discovery of the camera changed everything. It happened on a morning like any other. I woke early, bleary-eyed, and shuffled over to the window to let in some fresh air. That's when I noticed it, a small, glinting object taped to the underside of the fire escape landing right outside my window. It was subtle, easily missed if you weren't looking for it, but there was no mistaking what it was, a camera lens, pointed directly at my apartment. My hands shook as I peeled back the tape and held the device up to the light. It was crudely hidden, but functional. Someone had been recording me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All those nights of shadows, tapping, the notes, they hadn't been mere games or threats. They had been surveillance, a deliberate invasion of my privacy. I immediately called Jamie, my closest friend, and told her what I'd found. Her voice was sharp with concern. "You have to call the police," she said. "This is serious. You need help." I hesitated, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, but I knew she was right. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. The officer who arrived was empathetic but cautious. He took the camera as evidence and promised to investigate. But he warned me that these cases were difficult. Without catching the culprit in the act, proving who was behind it could be nearly impossible. The landlord was less cooperative. When I confronted him about the camera and the ongoing harassment, he grew defensive. "I told you, This building has had break-ins before, but we've increased security. I don't know who's doing this, but I'll look into it." His tone was dismissive, and I could tell he didn't want to get involved. Determined not to be a victim, I took matters into my own hands. I installed extra locks on all the windows and doors, bought motion-activated lights for the fire escape area, and set up my own security cameras inside the apartment, one pointed at the window facing the fire escape. Despite these precautions, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every creak of the building, every flicker of streetlight became a trigger for anxiety. I was hyper-aware of every sound at night, every shadow crossing the window. One evening, around midnight, the motion sensor by the window beeped frantically. I grabbed my phone and peeked through the curtain. There, crouched on the fire escape just outside, was a figure dressed in black, face obscured by a hood. The person was motionless, staring directly at my window. My heart pounded wildly. I wanted to scream, to call out, but fear rooted me in place. After several tense minutes, the figure raised a gloved hand and tapped 3 times on the glass. The deliberate pattern sent chills down my spine. Then, as silently as they'd appeared, the figure vanished into the night. I called Jamie again, my voice trembling as I described what had happened. She insisted I stay with her for a few days, but I refused. I wanted to reclaim my space, to prove to myself I wasn't afraid. The police increased patrols around the building, but it didn't help. The intruder was always one step ahead, slipping away before anyone arrived. The notes kept appearing on my doorstep, each one more cryptic and disturbing. One read simply, "You can't hide." The psychological toll was crushing. I stopped inviting friends over, stopped opening my curtains during the day. My world shrank to the confines of my locked apartment. Sleep became elusive. I found myself awake for hours, staring at the window, waiting for the next sign. One night, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the window. Outside, faint footprints led up the fire escape, and on the landing was a single metal folding chair facing my window. It was out of place, disturbing in its intentionality. I called the police immediately. They arrived quickly and took photographs. The chair was removed, but no fingerprints or clues were found. The officer admitted it was likely left by the person watching me. A taunt, a way to say, "I'm here." I felt trapped in a nightmare. The city that once felt alive and vibrant had become a prison. I thought about moving, but the idea of leaving everything behind was overwhelming. One afternoon, after weeks of sleepless nights, I finally confronted the landlord again. I demanded he show me the fire escape and the neighboring apartments. Reluctantly, he agreed. The place was dusty and neglected. The fire escape stairs were covered in dirt and debris, but what caught my eye was the metal chair, identical to the one found on my landing, folded up and hidden in a corner of a vacant apartment next door. It was clear someone had been using that space as a hideout. The police were called back to investigate the neighboring unit, but it was empty. No signs of recent habitation, no evidence of the person who'd been watching me. I installed more security cameras, changed all the locks again, and tried to reclaim some sense of safety. But the damage was done. The feeling of being watched lingered, a shadow always lurking just out of sight. I started seeing a therapist to help cope with the anxiety and paranoia. She told me what I was experiencing was common in cases of stalking and harassment, feelings of helplessness, fear, and isolation. Despite all efforts, the intruder was never caught. The police files went cold, and the landlord refused to take further responsibility. I was left with an apartment that felt invaded, a life that felt uncertain. Some nights, I still think I see shadows moving beyond the curtains, or hear the tapping on the glass. I wonder how long this had been going on before I noticed, and whether the person watching is still out there, waiting for their next chance. I don't know what their intentions were, or why they chose me. All I know is that for a long time, I wasn't alone in that apartment, and the fire escape wasn't just an emergency exit. It was their vantage point to watch my every move. After weeks of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, I finally made the decision to move. The apartment that once felt like an exciting new chapter had become a prison, each creak and shadow a reminder of the unseen eyes that had invaded my privacy. I found a place in a quieter neighborhood, far from the city's chaotic pulse, and, hopefully, far from whoever had been watching me. The new apartment was in a small suburban complex, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined streets. It was a far cry from the gritty urban landscape I'd left behind. I was relieved to trade the constant buzz of the city for the relative calm of suburbia. The neighbors were friendly, waving hello as I moved boxes inside, and the backyard opened onto a patch of dense woods that stretched beyond the property line. At first, I felt a fragile sense of safety, but that comfort was short-lived. The woods at the edge of the backyard felt oddly foreboding. Dense and dark, they seemed to swallow sound and light. I'd never been one to be scared of nature, but there was something unsettling about how still it was, how the trees seemed to loom like silent sentinels. I found myself avoiding the backyard at dusk, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. Then the strange things began. It started with small noises, footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway when no one should have been there, the flicker of porch lights turning on and off without explanation. I'd been careful with locking doors and windows, but the feeling of eyes watching me seeped back in. One evening, I was sitting on the couch when I noticed a flicker from the porch light outside. I glanced through the window and saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the yard, partially hidden by the trees. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, but then I found footprints in the soft earth near the tree line. Bare footprints, oddly shaped, and circling the house. They led nowhere, disappearing into the dark woods. The next day, I found strange symbols carved into the bark of the trees bordering the backyard. Jagged lines and circles, etched deep enough to draw blood. I took pictures and showed them to a neighbor, who looked uneasy but said she'd never seen anything like it before. At night, the porch light flickered again, and I found notes slipped under the door. One read, "We see you," in the same messy handwriting that had once haunted my city apartment. The sense of being watched was no longer a figment of paranoia. It was undeniable. I called the police, explaining the strange symbols, the footprints, the notes. They increased patrols in the neighborhood and promised to investigate. But like before, there was no solid evidence, no suspects. One night, I heard movement outside the window. I peeked through the curtains and saw a tall figure standing just beyond the backyard fence, partially illuminated by the porch light. The person held something in their hand, a knife, gleaming faintly in the darkness. I froze, heart pounding. The figure spoke softly, voice barely audible but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "I'm watching you." I backed away from the window and called 911. Police arrived within minutes, but the figure had vanished. They scoured the woods and surrounding streets, but found nothing. The experience shattered any remaining sense of safety. I installed motion-activated lights around the house, security cameras pointing into the yard, and reinforced all locks. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. Friends urged me to consider moving again, but I was exhausted. The pattern was clear. No matter where I went, this presence followed, lurking just beyond reach. I sought help from a therapist, trying to untangle the fear from reality. She listened patiently as I recounted the events, validating my feelings and helping me develop coping strategies. But even with support, I couldn't shake the dread. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window and saw eyes behind me, eyes that weren't my own. I spun around, but the room was empty. That night, more footprints circled the house, and the notes grew more threatening. I realized that the woods weren't just a backdrop. They were a hiding place, a veil for whoever was watching. And the watchers were no longer content to remain unseen. The presence had moved closer, crossing the boundary from distant observer to active threat. I knew I couldn't stay here safely, but the thought of leaving again filled me with despair. The city, the suburbs, it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched had become woven into my life, an inescapable shadow. I was left questioning where safety could ever be found, and whether it even existed anymore. In the summer of 2018, a group of friends and I decided to escape the unease that had settled into my life with a camping trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to breathe mountain air and forget the shadows that seemed to follow me. We pitched our tents in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, far from any town or road. The first night was peaceful. The crackling campfire, the stars overhead, and the sound of crickets lulled us into a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. But on the second night, That calm began to unravel. Marcus, one of my friends, claimed he saw something moving in the woods. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the darkness, when he suddenly stood and said, "There's someone out there." We laughed it off at first, thinking it was just nerves or maybe an animal. But as the night deepened, unease crept in. I lay in my tent, the thin fabric doing little to muffle the sounds of the forest. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing, slow and deliberate, just beyond the tent flap. I held my breath, heart pounding. The breathing stopped. Then, footsteps, barefoot, soft but unmistakable, circled the perimeter of our campsite. I whispered to the others, but they heard nothing. The next morning, we found footprints around the tents. Most were boot prints, but one was a bare human foot, muddy and oddly large. The discovery unsettled us all. We debated leaving, but the forest was vast and our supplies limited. Later that day, while gathering firewood, I caught sight of a naked man crouched behind a tree, watching us. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and when he saw I noticed him, he vanished into the underbrush. That night, the terror escalated. As we sat huddled in our tents, a voice whispered, "I see you guys." The words seemed to come from every direction, carried on the wind. Then, someone began unzipping my tent. I screamed, and my friends shouted in alarm. Whoever it was fled into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. At dawn, shaken and exhausted, we packed up quickly. On the way out, we stopped at the ranger station and told them what had happened. They nodded grimly and shared reports of a man living in the woods, someone who had been stealing from campers and lurking near campsites for months. The experience left me rattled, the feeling of unseen eyes more real than ever. I realized that no matter where I went, the watchers were out there, waiting, watching, and sometimes stepping just beyond the edge of sight. The forest, the suburbs, the city, they all held their own secrets, their own threats. After that trip, I knew I couldn't ignore the terror anymore. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a reality, and it was one I would carry with me wherever I went.